In 1884, William James published an article in Mind magazine that proposed one of the most counterintuitive ideas in the history of psychology. We do not tremble because we are afraid, he argued. We are afraid because we tremble. We do not cry because we feel sad. We feel sad because we cry. The emotion, in other words, is not the cause of the bodily change. It is the perception of the bodily change. This was the James-Lange theory of emotion, so called because Carl Lange, a Danish physiologist, had independently proposed something similar at roughly the same time. It was immediately controversial, immediately influential, and almost immediately buried under objections. Walter Cannon, the Harvard physiologist, attacked it in the 1920s on what seemed like compelling grounds. The visceral changes James pointed to were too slow, too nonspecific, too similar across different emotions to be the source of the felt difference between, say, fear and grief. The theory fell out of fashion. Generations of students learned that James had been interestingly wrong. And then, in the 1990s, neuroscience started vindicating him. Antonio Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis, the proposal that emotional decision-making is fundamentally grounded in representations of bodily states, was essentially a sophisticated neurological version of the James-Lange theory. The discovery that patients with damage to areas of the brain involved in processing bodily signals became catastrophically bad at practical decision-making, even when their rational intelligence remained intact, demonstrated that James was right about something crucial. The body is not the background to emotion. The body is the emotions mechanism. Contemporary research on embodied cognition, the field that studies how the body's posture, movement, and sensory state influence cognitive and emotional processing, is Jamesian through and through. When researchers find that people who hold expansive postures report higher feelings of confidence and take bolder decisions, when they find that walking produces more creative thinking than sitting, when they find that facial expressions influence rather than merely express emotional states, they're generating empirical support for what James was saying in 1884. Act as if you feel it, and the feeling follows. The body is not a vehicle for the mind. It is the mind's primary instrument. James's treatment of habit anticipated neural plasticity by about 90 years. He argued that repeated actions literally changed the structure of the nervous system, that the brain was plastic, not fixed, and that with use, certain neural pathways became progressively more efficient, making the associated behaviors more automatic and less effortful. In 1890, the neuroscience for this was entirely unavailable. James was inferring, from functional evidence and from William Carpenter's concept of unconscious cerebration, a structural reality that the microscopes of his day could not reach. Now we have the microscopes, and the fMRI machines, and the molecular biology of synaptic strengthening. We know, in detail, that James could not have imagined how long-term potentiation works, how repeated activation of neural pathways increases their synaptic strength, making the associated patterns more likely to fire and more efficiently transmitted. We know that the hippocampus grows in response to certain kinds of spatial learning. We know that meditation practice thickens the prefrontal cortex. We know that the habits James described, and the plasticity that underlies them, are real, physical facts about the architecture of the nervous system. The conclusion James drew from all this, that we should form good habits early, that we should exploit the plasticity of the young nervous system, that the consolidation of good habits was among the most important things a person could do for their future self, is now written in the language of neuroscience rather than the language of Victorian moral psychology, but the content is substantially the same. James's account of attention has become one of the most active areas of contemporary neuroscience and clinical psychology. His observation that the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention, over and over again, is the very root of judgment, character, and will was intuited by introspection. We now have the neural machinery of attentional control mapped in considerable detail, the interplay of the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex in top-down attention regulation, the default mode network's tendency to generate mind-wandering, the way stress narrows and depletes attentional resources. James's recommendation that training voluntary attention was the most important educational task is now the scientific rationale for mindfulness-based interventions, which have been shown in hundreds of studies to improve attentional control, reduce mind-wandering, and decrease depression and anxiety. The therapeutic movement called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, is perhaps the most explicitly Jamesian of contemporary clinical approaches. ACT proposes that psychological suffering is largely the product of our entanglement with the contents of our own minds, our tendency to treat thoughts as facts, to fuse with our narratives, to avoid the uncomfortable. The therapeutic task is not to change the content of the thoughts but to change our relationship to them, to develop what ACT calls psychological flexibility, the ability to observe your own mental contents without being controlled by them, to act from your values rather than from your fears. This is James's pragmatic approach to the self translated into clinical technique, not the self as a fixed thing to be defended or corrected, but the self as an ongoing process to be engaged, redirected, and gradually rebuilt through the accumulation of new actions. The recovery movement, the positive psychology movement, the coaching industry at its most rigorous, all of these draw water from the Jamesian well. The idea that change begins with action rather than insight, that you do not wait until you feel ready to act differently but act differently in order to feel differently, that the emotions follow the behaviors rather than leading them. This is the Jamesian insight that every effective brief therapy has rediscovered in different vocabulary. Behavioral activation, the evidence-based treatment for depression that consists essentially of scheduling pleasant or meaningful activities whether or not you feel like it, is the clinical operationalization of James's observation that the great thing is to bring the machine to bear on whatever object the occasion requires. James did not invent psychology, but he gave it its characteristic American shape: empirical, practical, resistant to pure theorizing, perpetually asking whether the idea helps. Contemporary neuroscience and therapy, at their best, still hold to that shape. They still ask, does it work? Can we test it? What does it change in practice? They ask, in other words, what James called the cash value question. And in the texture of those questions, and in the direction of the most productive research, the spirit of William James remains more present than most contemporary scientists know. Subscribe to the Psychology of William James to explore more of his timeless ideas.